In 1933, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany, bringing with them a brutal ideology of racial purity, nationalism, and intolerance. The horrors of World War I and the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles had left Germany fractured, and the Nazi Party promised to restore the nation to its former glory. But the price of that glory would be paid in blood, as the Nazis began a systematic campaign to eliminate those they deemed undesirable. Among the most tragic victims of this regime were homosexuals, whose very existence was seen as a threat to the state's vision of an ideal Aryan society. From the moment Hitler became chancellor, homosexuals in Germany faced increased persecution. The Nazis viewed homosexuality as a threat to their vision of a strong, militaristic, and racially pure society. In their eyes, homosexual men were weak, degenerate, and incapable of contributing to the Nazi ideals of family, reproduction, and the survival of the Aryan race. Homosexuality, they believed, was an obstacle to the growth and strength of the German nation. While homosexuality had long been a criminal offense under German law, the Nazis took this repression to new heights. In 1935, Hitler's regime expanded the legal framework used to punish homosexual acts. The infamous Section 175 of the German Penal Code, which had been in place since the 19th century, was tightened, criminalizing male homosexuality in a way that would set the stage for mass arrests and imprisonment. The penalty for engaging in homosexual acts grew harsher, and the state increasingly began to target homosexual men both within and outside of the Nazi Party. But it wasn't just the legal framework that fueled this persecution. The very ideology of the Nazi regime sought to rid the country of homosexuality. Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, was a major driving force behind the anti-homosexual movement. Himmler viewed homosexuality as a disease that had to be eradicated to protect the health of the nation. Under his leadership, the SS became notorious for raiding homosexual clubs and bars, arresting anyone suspected of being homosexual, and subjecting them to brutal treatment. In addition to the legal system, the Nazis established the Volksgemeinschaft, which was meant to unify the German people under one ideology. But for homosexuals, this idea of unity was unattainable. They were marginalized, targeted, and expelled from public life. Homosexuality was portrayed as a symptom of moral decay, and the regime believed that rooting out this degeneracy would restore the nation to its rightful place in the world. Soon, the persecution escalated to the point where homosexuals were being sent to concentration camps. These men were forced to wear a pink triangle, a symbol that would become forever linked with their suffering. The pink triangle, originally used to mark homosexuals in the camps, became a symbol of their identity as victims of Nazi brutality. In the camps, homosexuals were subjected to the same horrific conditions as Jews, Romani people, disabled individuals, and other marginalized groups. They were forced to perform hard labor, subjected to violence and humiliation, and often murdered by the Nazis. The horrific treatment of homosexuals in the concentration camps was not only physical but psychological. They were often treated as the lowest of the low, even among other prisoners. Homosexual men faced additional abuse from other prisoners as they were viewed with disgust and fear. The mental toll of being labeled as subhuman and treated like vermin was devastating. Homosexual men were denied basic human dignity and subjected to constant dehumanization. But even in the face of such brutality, there were acts of resistance. Some homosexual men in the camps formed tight-knit communities of support, while others secretly defied the regime's oppression by engaging in acts of rebellion. These small acts of resistance, though often invisible to the outside world, were a testament to the strength and resilience of those who were determined to survive despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. As the war progressed, the persecution of homosexuals continued to escalate, and the Nazi regime's obsession with controlling every aspect of life intensified. The atrocities committed against homosexuals under Nazi rule were largely overshadowed by the mass murder of Jews during the Holocaust. But the persecution of homosexuals was no less brutal. They were among the many victims of the Nazi regime's genocidal ambitions. The eventual defeat of the Nazis in 1945 did not bring an immediate end to the suffering of homosexuals in Germany. After the war, the laws that criminalized homosexuality remained in place, and many of the survivors of Nazi persecution continued to face discrimination and harassment. The full scope of the brutality faced by homosexuals during the Nazi era was not widely recognized for decades, and it wasn't until the late 20th century that their suffering began to be acknowledged. Today, the legacy of the persecution of homosexuals during Nazi Germany is an important reminder of the dangers of unchecked political power, hatred, and intolerance. The brutal fate of homosexuals under Nazi rule serves as a painful chapter in the broader history of the Holocaust, and it remains a symbol of the fight for LGBTQ+ rights and equality. As we reflect on the horrific treatment of homosexuals under Nazi Germany, we are reminded of the importance of tolerance, human dignity, and the need to protect the rights of all individuals, regardless of their sexual orientation. As the Nazi regime grew more powerful, its persecution of homosexuals intensified, leading to a tragic and relentless campaign against a marginalized community. While Jews, Romani, disabled individuals, and political enemies of the state were subjected to mass murder and genocide, homosexuals experienced a different kind of violence, one that combined imprisonment, forced labor, and a systematic attempt to erase their very existence from history. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the horrors of Nazi Germany were magnified. For homosexuals, the war only increased their suffering. Many were sent to the brutal concentration camps, where they endured grueling forced labor, starvation, and rampant abuse. The pink triangle, worn by homosexual prisoners to identify them as such, became a permanent mark of humiliation and exclusion. In the camps, homosexual men were often subjected to brutal treatment by both the SS guards and fellow prisoners. They were treated as the lowest form of life, even among the other marginalized groups. Many were subjected to cruel experiments conducted by Nazi doctors as part of the regime's scientific attempts to cure homosexuality. These experiments often included castration, forced sterilization, and other forms of medical torture. For those who were fortunate enough to survive the concentration camps, the psychological toll was devastating. Homosexuals were not only persecuted for their sexuality, but were also isolated, marked as subhuman by the Nazi ideology. Even after the war, when the Holocaust ended and Nazi rule fell, many of the survivors carried the scars of this persecution with them. The trauma of living through such intense violence and degradation took an immense emotional and psychological toll. But even after the Nazis were defeated, the suffering did not end. The laws that criminalized homosexuality under Section 175 of the German Penal Code remained in effect after the war, continuing to persecute homosexuals even in post-war Germany. This was especially true in the early years following World War II, as many homosexuals who had survived the camps faced ongoing societal discrimination and legal challenges. They were often forced to remain silent about their experiences, fearing further persecution or stigma. For decades after the war, the true extent of the suffering of homosexuals under Nazi rule remained hidden. In a world that was largely hostile to LGBTQ+ rights, survivors of the persecution were often ignored or silenced, and their stories were overshadowed by the larger tragedies of the Holocaust. For many, there was no recognition, no memorial, and no justice for the crimes committed against them. The fight for LGBTQ+ rights in the years following World War II was difficult, as many people, especially in Germany, were still reluctant to acknowledge the persecution that had occurred. It wasn't until decades later, during the 1970s and 1980s, that the world began to fully recognize the suffering of homosexuals during the Nazi era. In 1985, the German government officially acknowledged that homosexuals had been targeted by the Nazis, and in the 1990s, the pink triangle was recognized as a symbol of remembrance for the victims of Nazi persecution. However, even today, many LGBTQ advocates and survivors continue to call for more recognition and justice for the homosexual victims of Nazi Germany. The trauma they endured, both during and after the war, has left a lasting impact on the LGBTQ+ community, and it is a painful reminder of the dangers of political regimes that seek to target marginalized groups. The brutal fate of homosexuals under Nazi Germany serves as a reminder of the destructive power of hate and the depths to which human cruelty can sink. But it also reminds us of the resilience and survival of those who fought back against their persecution. Though their voices were silenced for many years, their stories are now being heard, and their struggle for dignity and equality continues to inspire the fight for LGBTQ rights around the world. The persecution of homosexuals during Nazi Germany remains one of the darkest chapters in both LGBTQ+ and world history. It was a campaign driven by hatred, fear, and intolerance, but it also reveals the strength of human resilience. As we reflect on the suffering of these men, we are reminded of the importance of equality, human rights, and the need to protect those who are most vulnerable in our societies. The lessons learned from this painful history are crucial in ensuring that we never allow such persecution to happen again.